board to help make us make the decisions what's best for the citizens of Pickens County. Thank you for our many blessings. Thank you for our freedoms that we have in this country and for those soldiers that are fighting for those freedoms. Be with our elected officials both here, at the local, state, and federal level. Be with our president's cabinets, our military, especially our soldiers fighting overseas. Again, go with us throughout this week. Keep us safe, and let us remember, Lord, where all our blessings come from. And these many favors and things I ask in our Son's name. Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Item 2 is reading of last meeting's minutes.
Under the third item for Janice Allen, the vote on that indicates that Mr. Hendricks was here, but he's not listed in attendance. All the other votes are 4-0, and that one was 5-0.
So Toddy was not here.
He's not listed in attendance.
Oh, okay.
I'm just curious. I don't know which one's right, I guess, is my point.
Yeah.
It seems like he was here.
I thought he was here too.
I believe he was here.
Well, and just for example, the previous vote on the Vanderwaltz, he was not listed as voting.
Okay, the Vanderwaltz was the previous month, actually, it was, I think,
He missed.
July was the last time we were here.
yeah, and
Okay.
so he may have missed that one when they had that vote at 4-0.
If I
Saying
recall,
that this-
No, there wasn't, I apologize, Vanderwaltz was the last one, you're right.
he's not here to tell us whether or not he.
Somebody called me.
I'm pretty sure he was here last
I
time.
thought he was here too. But he said, I remember,
Wow.
he said he wasn't, he hadn't been feeling well.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken. He wasn't?
He had to get up and leave.
That's right. He had to leave early, so that may be why he didn't vote,
Okay.
because he left early.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. That was the only question I had.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
So why wasn't he listed in attendance if it was for a partial time?
I'd have to ask Marcia.
And she's retired, so.
Don't want to cut him out of his per diem check there.
Yeah,
I think I signed off on that one, I remember.
That may break us off.
So do we need to add him there to the
Hey, I
attendance?
know he was there for part of it, he did leave early.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to approve the minutes subject to the correction noted.
Second. Okay, we move in second, any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Motion carries. The third item is old business. We have one item on the agenda, that's to review the county ordinances. I'll ask Rodney.
Yes, sir. You have a copy of the ordinances as proposed by Mr. Ethan Calhoun. And like I said, they're to be reviewed, and if you are in agreement with those or changes or alterations or anything, then we would move forward with having an open meeting and moving them on to the commissioner's office for sign off on with your recommendation or however you'd like to do it. Mr. Calhoun's here to answer any questions that you may have, and if not, then I'll try to answer them as well.
Ethan, you want to tell us about this stuff?
Yes, Mr. President, I'll be glad to kind of do a quick run through for y'all. I think everybody has a handout real quick, and it's got a couple of notations on there. I think there's some red text. Where you see that red text, that's where I was looking in the ordinance trying to figure out for some of these recommendations where they may actually fit into your existing ordinance without causing too much of a ripple effect and that sort of a thing. So on those,
So is this all new language? Or?
this would be new language. If you see it in red, this would be language that you do not currently have, that would just be in addition to what you have in place. And this would just be essentially where it would, based on my interpretation of the ordinance. Of course, Mr. Buckingham and attorney may also have opinions on those sorts of things, but these are the places that I found it seems like these would fit inside the ordinance.
And they're not in conflict with anything within the ordinance in which you've listed?
Not that I've been able to find to this point. I'm going to continue to look very thoroughly and cross-check and make sure that we're not in conflict with anything in your ordinance. So far, I've not been able to find anything. I think the easiest part are definitions. I've been looking through those, and those are listed alphabetically, so trying to go through your definition section in the ordinance and figure out just what you have definitions for, because that sometimes is the hardest part of the job, is to get a clear, cut, and effective definition for the use that we're talking about. And I think some of the issues, I think this is my third time with y'all to kind of talk about some of the things, some of the issues y'all were having or concerns you were having with some things that have come up. And I know one of those was the issue with non-conventional dwellings, so people that were using sometimes even campers and RVs, so on and so forth, or the potential for people to do things like shipping containers and tiny homes, and the concern with that, and some ways that could be dealt with. I think we talked about that a little bit in the last meeting. I think we was just talking about adding some language that say, prohibited uses, residential occupancy, and then having that caveat of temporary location just for things like emergencies or construction and things like that. So make sure that you also have that in there just for those folks that do need to have a temporary residence while something else is being done, or manage a construction project, maybe a big commercial construction project. A lot of times they'll have a foreman on site that'll stay there 24/7. So that's what that temporary location is designed for. And then of course yes, sir.
To that one, I got a question. It mentions no overnight sleeping, but I mean, if they're doing it for, construction security, somebody may be there overnight. And more particularly, if somebody's building a custom home, and I know it's happened several times, they've got a travel trailer there temporarily for that 90 days or 6-month window till they get it all dried in, and they move into the more permanent structure. So I understand the intent, and I agree with not just having, lots littered with tiny homes or non-conventional dwellings, so to speak, but I would not want to create an ordinance that necessarily prohibits, the custom home market, because that's typically a very positive impact on the county. So I'm not sure how to account for that, whether it's, you only allow a single structure with limited number of occupants or usage, or I don't know. I don't know how you would do that, but I wouldn't want to have that unintended consequence of trying to do something that isn't happening in widespread with something that's a pretty standard building method.
Right, so in specifically dealing with the temporary location clause there, looking at overnight sleeping, we may want to not have that restrictive, is that what we're saying? Just to have that ability so that if somebody did need to stay there on site.
Yeah, or, even, if it can be there for 6 months, but maybe restrict overnight sleeping to 90 days or something, I don't know.
Could you provide for some sort of permitting process through land development, or when they were building a home, they could also, we would have to piggyback onto another permit, but they would, wide situation, be allowed to have that.
I think we could base it on something like that. We could have that instead of having just to say no overnight sleeping, we could use a language like that to make that work, but not
Overnight use would require an amendment or an addendum to the permit or something like that.
Right, and I think it could be done that way. And that'd be a way to keep track of it too, because that's where it's kind of tough, is the permitting process, and how does code enforcement actually keep track of when that clock starts and when it stops.
Or that-
So that might be.
Yeah, because most of the ones I'm referring to, they want to get out of that travel trailer, you know? So but you don't want to limit that
But
building method.
I guess really what y'all are looking to limit is the year-round use of the camper as a home.
Just during their construction period, really, until they
No,
move
no,
in.
the purpose of having this and putting this in the ordinance is to stop
A permanent dwelling.
the permanent dwelling. We've got it in there.
Yeah, and
Just during the construction period. When that house is finished, they're out of, the camper goes away.
yeah, it could be that, yeah, it could be tied to a building permit. So, yeah, if you're tying it to a building permit, that's,
Or at the
Yeah.
latest, to see
that
it.
would, yeah,
That's what I'm saying, time to the building permit, then you still have the ability to.
must be removed within X number of days of the CO or.
Yeah, something like that.
Just let it
Yeah.
go. Would you
That would
require a
work.
sticker to be issued for it to, like you do with mobile homes? Where you, the build officer knows if it's got the thing in it?
We could put a caveat in there, something like I think there is the mobile home, it has to have that placard on it that says it passed the international inspection for.
No, I just know that they were in compliance with the county's permitting system, so that somebody driving by would see the sticker and.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you tie it to the building permit, you gotta have the building permit on display, so it could be shown with the building permit.
Use the term manufactured home, would that also include mobile homes?
The state law separates those two terms. Mobile homes, I believe the year is 1974. Anything prior to that was before the, I want to say, Manufactured Home Act that basically set forth new standards, because before that, the standards were very loose, and what we call mobile homes were more loosely governed by building code back then. So there were some public safety concerns by the international building code and so forth. So they made an act sometime around, I believe it was 1974, and anything after that is considered a manufactured home. And that's the current standard today still for those homes. And they have to have a placard displayed on them that says they passed that, or they were built in compliance with that standard.
I got a question about living in the campers. Some people can't afford nothing else. In fact, we had a write-up in the paper about a veteran that been living over there for 15 years in one, and now they tell him he gotta move.
That is the downside to making an ordinance change like this. And I don't think that in that case, if they were already in existence, it would probably fall under a non-conforming policy, I'm assuming in your ordinance.
Depending on when he started. But I don't think we've, since 2005,
So
unless it's in their
it's already out of compliance.
Well, Harold, in the example you were given, they were living in a park or something, right? It wasn't just.
Living in a trailer park.
Trailer park.
Been there for 15 years. Now they told him he's got to move because the trailer park isn't zoned for campers or something. I don't understand that part of it.
Campers aren't a permitted permanent living structure currently. So if what a lot of them are doing is they'll come in and request a temporary power service for a well or for a storage building or something like that. You go back a couple of months later and there's a camper there hooked up and they're living in it.
But you're talking about individual lot as opposed to a park.
Yeah, a park, if it's set up with our ordinance, we currently have them camper park, that if they have it, I believe there's one, possibly a second one in the county.
But those don't allow for more than so many days consecutively. They're not going to, a mobile home park is a separate.
Mobile home parks, they can do a permanent.
It's a separate section. It just gets regulated completely different than campgrounds, and we have no hybrids. And so what happened on that case? There's one case here recently where they moved campers into mobile home trailer parks on those spots after they removed the mobile home.
one down on Refuge Road, just about all campers now. and
Every one of those is out of compliance. They have no legal right to be there. None of those do.
So the person operating the park,
Yeah, he's been contacted, but we'll eventually have a lawsuit over that. See, that was a mobile home park. That took all the mobile homes off. The mobile home park itself was put in there prior to zoning. So they had a vested property right to maintain that after zoning went into place, but only for as long as they maintained that use. And then when the bank foreclosed on it, they removed all the mobile homes, so it was no longer eligible to be a mobile home park. But that's kind of irrelevant because they never tried to make it a mobile home park, they just put campers in there. So they don't have the right to put campers in there because it's not regulated as a camper. That's what we got into with the last land development officer we had. But no, they don't have the right to have this there.
Do the existing ordinances as far as safety and inspections and everything, did they take care of that so that they could, if they had the water and the sewage and everything? So we don't want to end up with a homeless problem.
Are you referring to a camper? Campers don't meet the minimum building codes. The manufactured home they're inspected by the federal government since, like I said, 1974. So they have to meet that criteria of the federal government. Campers, I don't have, excuse me, any kind of building codes, minimum codes that they have to meet in order for a living structure. And then the problem that we have is if they do permit that and move forward, they want a certificate of occupancy, which is basically the county saying, yes, it does meet that criteria, and then it puts the county in a difficult position if anything ever happens to that camper.
One of the things Board of Commissioners have looked at, and I don't know if we can do it or not, is we have a lot of people living in a camper that have been in that situation for many, many years. Like you said, they can't afford another place, and what do you do? And I think one of the concerns is not to create a jurisdiction where they're allowed to remain in perpetuity. Is there a way to index the ones that we have and create, they don't have a vested property right, but create some sort of exception to the ordinance for the ones that are already in existence? They just don't allow anything going forward.
Kind of grandfathering of sorts.
But it would not apply to something like a campground or a trailer or a file mobile home park that's not in compliance. That would not be part of that.
But we do have provisions in our code for both.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah,
our
yeah,
guidelines for a
but they're
campground.
But they're separate.
Right, and they are,
Yes.
yeah.
And there are guidelines for mobile home parks as well.
And you get some people that have a mobile home park that think it's can't be used as a campground, but we don't have a hybrid where some jurisdictions do.
so the way this is written, then, somebody owns a lot. They could not put a camper on that lot unless they were going to build a structure that met the building guidelines, and it was going to be there for that incremental time while the new residence would be built.
Currently, what we're doing is that if you wish to live in a camper for a short period of time, like you get a building permit. There's an example out on Highway 53 West. There was an individual that got a building permit for a house. He signed a letter from us stating that he would live in the camper no more than 1 year while he built his house. That's the length of time for the permit for the for the house, and he did exactly that. He finished his house, moved the camper out. So, I mean, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're hoping for. Unfortunately, yes, and I agree with you. The things that we're starting to see are like coming in and asking for those temporary power. Once that power is connected to that camper, it's very, very difficult to have that camper removed. And then you may or may not have health concerns with whether or not it's in a septic, whether it's been attached to a septic. That's the kind of stuff that we're starting to get into now.
On the west end, we had a family, as you know, last winter, they were living in tents. They have started building a house now,
Yeah.
but I mean, I'm worried about them all winter. Because
I've seen everything from requesting for tents to living in a shipping container.
now there's a shipping container on a lot on Henderson Mountain now, a blue one, there's someone living in that.
That's the problem without having a full-fledged code enforcement department, is sometimes they will bring in a shipping container and use it as a storage container, and then sometime along the way it transitions into a living structure that they'll rent out to people or something like that. And that's when we have to get the marshal involved, but then now you're starting to get into full-fledged code enforcement, which is a whole nother animal altogether.
So tents are not listed as an acceptable form here, so tents would not be allowed.
Currently,
Yes, it requires facilities any camper tent on it.
I only know of one tent that
Yeah.
I'm aware of, and it's over on, somewhere on the west end, over off Henderson Mountain Road. That's the only one, yeah, that's the only one that I'm aware of.
But going back to y'all's direction to Ethan, to Lee's point, basically modify this to where with an existing building permit, you do have the right to temporarily occupy a home for the length of time, or about a camper.
Right.
For the length of time it takes to get the home built. And then you want us to look at some sort of system to grandfather in existing campers on lots, not campers on in campgrounds or mobile home farms.
Could you venture a guess at the number of units, for lack of a better word, countywide that you would see that this would apply to in terms of grandfathering them in?
I would hate to hazard a guess. I know that we stumble into them. The tax assessors, when they're out doing their thing, they send me notifications and stuff of different lots that have campers on them, or that they're utilizing. Some of them are just straight up on an individual lot. Some of them, they're running drop cords out the backside of the house and running 2 to 3 of them.
Wow. I think it's more than 100, less than 100.
I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 would probably be safe.
So to run the drop cords would be kind of an extended family, or friends, or whatever.
Close friends.
Yeah. That's right, free electricity. But Phil, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's your summary of.
I don't think that's a practical measure we can, but I think it would create some other social issues, removing them that are attached to a family's compound or land or whatever else. I do think that the more transient nature and commercial nature of a campground and a mobile home park lends up to different consideration. We would have to have some, if y'all do the grandfather, if we go that route, we'd have to have some sort of legislative finding of board commissioners to have as to why they are making that distinction. I think that would be the foundation of it, is one's a commercial professional point.
No, I have had 3 inquiries within the last 6 months on putting in a campground or for campers. So somebody is assessing and seeing the need for them and starting to look at the potential of putting something in.
What is that criteria?
For
Campground.
one of them was wanting to catch snowbirds. One of them was wanting to do it for a, let's say, a large-scale building project, commercial, and they had the workers that are coming in from elsewhere, a place for them to stay, and he was wanting to do it predominantly for that. The third one has noticed that there's maybe, I think, 1 campground that we have currently in the county, and was interested in the possibility of putting one in like a KOA type campground. So, I mean, there are various reasons.
But what goes with that is water, sewer.
Yes, and then you start to get into what the health department will allow as far as how many units per acre, what kind of structures, or infrastructure are you gonna have as far as the roads, the trash, the pull-off spots, lights, utilities, all that kind of stuff goes in. It's almost like a mini subdivision.
So Phil, you're suggesting that the grandfather,
But just, if you want us, we can explore to see if that's a possibility.
but to the point I was at, we were talking about with the extended family where extension cords are coming
Yeah.
out.
Something along the lines of what Pat was talking about for you. It's,
It doesn't seem safe.
now that, there would be safety issues with that as far as inspection, but maybe that lends another problem. You know, are we taking on responsibility, once we permit these, are we taking on responsibility for you know, regulating that aspect, the safety aspect of it as well? Well, all I'm asking right at this level is that what your appetite is? If it is, we can go back and explore and see if it's a possibility and what other cans of worms could open is going to do it. So,
I mean, I think it needs to be looked at, in my view.
I agree. I mean, a misguided commercial operation that's changed its, you know, conditions is one thing that, you know, but people that are owners or friends of the owners of the land, it's just 2 or 3 here and there, it'd be rough to enact something that just kicks them out of there. They've been living here 10, 15 years.
I think that creates some social issues.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to see that.
On the minimum square footage, is that what is dealing with the shipping containers and the tiny home?
Yes, sir, that would be the most effective way, to my knowledge, to deal with those types of scenarios, is to just set forth some minimum square footage for the homes.
Do we have, in your stuff, when you come up with the final version of this, do you have findings of fact as to why we're making those determinations? Why do we want 900 and
That was gonna be my next.
I base that on several communities in the region that I've worked with that do have minimum square footages for their zoning districts. And generally, as you move up in restrictiveness in the zone district, especially in residential, we usually have the larger lots.
But do y'all have that language that we can put in the resolution to get us over that, you know, the sign case?
Are you talking about the legislation that's going forward now?
No, I'm talking about the, it's the biggest case where we got burned because our sign ordinance did not have any sort of legislative finding about board commissions to why they were regulating signs. Why was a billboard of this size different than one of eight other signs? And we just had sign ordinance. And Tinsley, Pickens County versus Tinsley, it was before my time. And so what I'm getting at is, I may be wrong about that. That may just be because of the type of the regulation of the sign was. But I'm worried. I guess what I'm saying is, do we need it with minimum house sizes? And if we do y'all have that bullet point language we can use that tracks these numbers?
I don't have any supporting case law or legislation in front of me that would immediately solve that. I can certainly look for that, so I can find that. This is just based on a couple of adjacent communities, and this was looking at your zone districts. These were the comparable to some of the adjacent.
It's no sea change, but
I can definitely look at that further and find some more support.
Don't worry, get to the point that we can have, if someone needs to build a very small place or have a place for a parent to move into, that it, we don't want to get to that point that they can't do that.
Yeah, or, you know, if I decided I want to, you know, come to Pickens County and buy 30, 40 acres of land and it's just me and my dog, and I want to build a 500-600 square foot house, I'd be dead blame if I'm going to let somebody tell me I can or cannot do that.
Yeah,
I mean, what's magical about 900 square feet versus 500 or 1,200 or?
That was one of the more less restrictive densities that I looked at for some of the surrounding communities. And it just creates a base to build off of. And usually in the larger, more restrictive zone districts, it becomes more restrictive as you move up. It's just a potential way to deal with some of those smaller buildings.
I think there's all kinds of unintended consequences there that we can't
Yeah.
see right now. I mean, yeah, again, if I bought the Tate House and want to build an in-law suite in the backyard to move my mother-in-law or father-in-law in there to take care of them, but I didn't want them living in the main house other than to come eat meals.
Well, if you bought the Tate House, it wouldn't put them in the equation of 900 square feet. You're not a very good person.
I didn't say I was.
But you're talking about making.
I didn't say I was. And most people would say that. But I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, if I just want to build them a nice bedroom with a little living space area, I mean, you know.
Okay, well, there's a way to deal with that, and I think what we're looking at here is that is the primary structure on the property. So if you had, let's say, an existing house that's there in that zone district, and you wanted to have the granny flat or the other building on there for a family member, there's ways that sort of use can be permitted through conditional use. We call them accessory dwelling units. So it's not the primary building on the property, it's an accessory use to the primary function, which is a residential building.
Okay, so last year, I guess it was, we had that tree house. People want to build tree houses out on the Henderson Mountain Road out that way. What's the difference between, if they wanted to go ahead and do that, what's the difference between a tree house and, which I doubt it's going to be much more than just a few hundred square feet? Is it kind of like a special event venue?
You'd also have, excuse me, but you would also have density requirements too. Like in ag, you would only have 1 per 10.
Right.
And so those tree houses going to be rural residential? Were they, if they were 1,000 square feet?
It was going to be agriculture if they had gone through, it would have been agriculture.
But the density per house per acre would have gotten there. They couldn't effectively do 1 per 10 acres. Just like they probably couldn't do 1 per acre and a half per acre for rural residential. But I don't know if that's good enough. I don't know if that's what y'all want to do or not.
Again, you get into the building codes as far as what your minimum is allowable and that sort of thing, especially if they're going to be requesting the certificate of occupancy, which once again places the county into a position of, do we sign off on this CO knowing that it doesn't meet our minimum criteria as far as ingress, egress, room size, that headroom in the event that the thing catches fire or whatever. I'm not necessarily opposed to it. It just puts the county into a very difficult position as to whether or not they want to sign off on that CO guaranteeing that structure.
What's the Southern Building Code or State Building Code? What do they say?
They call for, well, currently they have an amendment for what they call the tiny homes, and the counties can choose to adopt that or not. I have been in discussion with a couple of people, and we're trying to make a determination. The counties, the state of Georgia, are being requested that they adopt the new 2018 building codes, and I have been told that by at least one individual that amendment is going to be included in that 2018 codes. They're going to put it in there.
2018, which was last year.
Which, well, they're usually about 2 years behind. But it would go into effect January 1st of 2020. So that's one of the reasons why we're looking at, are we wanting to sign off on COs and for structures that may or may not have that safety aspect in there. Currently, we're unaware of any of the requirements specifically addressing it. It does talk about headroom. It talks about space above lofts, that sort of thing. but it doesn't have anything as far as size that I'm aware of currently. It's still being studied right now.
What's the intent of gross heated floor area? Is that per structure, or like on rural residential for 1,000 square feet? What if I got 5 200 square foot heated structures? Gross heated.
Usually if there's two different structures, the health department is going to require that you have two different septic systems, and that's when we say that you can't do it, because each one of them is going to require, let's say rural residential, 1.5 acres per residence for the structure. The health department is going to require that you have a septic system for each individual residence on that structure, and then you can't get to the minimum land size for that. So that's one of the things that without sewer, it does work in our favor. It can somewhat limit the number of structures you put on these pieces of property.
But my question is more about how does the math work on gross heated floor area? Say I got 10 acres and I got 2 500 square foot dwellings, heated floor space. Does that count for my 1,000?
Again, this is a proposal. We're trying to determine that. I
No,
don't.
but I can't, I mean, I don't know if that means you gotta have 1,000 minimum each single dwelling, or if I got 700 and 300, that gives me 1,000.
No, I would have to go with one.
I just wonder, what do you mean by gross heated floor area for a single
We can
family
check
home?
with Mr. Calhoun and see how that was addressed with other counties, but I would have to go that it was for per structure.
Ethan, how does the Southern Building Code fit into other jurisdiction planning with respect to questions like this? Is it adopted as part of the standard, or is it just a reference point?
Usually the building code is going to be housed in another ordinance, separate from the zoning ordinance, and the two work together, and you usually don't see conflict between the two. The zoning ordinance, of course, with certain zone districts, and the intent of that zone district may have more restrictive regulation imposed on it than the base and minimums allowed in the building code to protect things like adjacent property values, because certain zone districts are more restricted than others for reasons, and a lot of that generally comes into the economic value of the practice of the property. Now, if I may, I wanted to address one thing, Mr. Cagle, Chairman, that you brought up a second ago, and I have seen this done, that it's worked really well, is to create one zone district that does not have a minimum square footage requirement for your primary dwelling or secondary dwelling. And usually I've seen that recommended or done in a agricultural, everybody calls it something different, general agriculture or just agriculture zone district, because typically in an agricultural zone district, the lots are a lot bigger and your setbacks are usually pretty large. You can usually have sometimes even up to maybe 2 dwellings per lot, but those lots can be no smaller than usually several acres in size. And so that might be a way to address that, is to not require any minimum floor area size. That is something that some communities have done, and I think it's worked really well for them. Because no one's going to create a density issue on a general agriculture tract if you can only put 1 or 2 structures for every 3, 5 acres or whatever the base minimum is for your agricultural district. That's a way to not entirely limit that.
Well, Rodney, when somebody brings a plat to you and they want to develop a subdivision and they want to have certain criteria within that subdivision, then they're specifying for themselves what the minimum heated square footage would be within that subdivision, right?
Usually if a subdivision is brought forward, it is, they have covenants and restrictions.
Right.
And then it becomes imperative on them to enforce those covenants and restrictions. It's a civil matter and the county will not enforce the covenants. So, but when the subdivision is signed off, before it's signed off, they have to have covenants and restrictions in place, and then they are recorded along with that subdivision plat.
And so up to this point, the county has pretty well accepted whatever criteria they have put forward with respect to the size, minimum size of a home
Yes,
or dwelling.
yes.
because in the back of my mind, I can't remember in some of my travels for my job, I don't remember what county it was in, there was talk of building a tiny home subdivision. Again, I don't know what the size of these houses were, if they're 600, 700 square feet, whatever, 4 or 5, I have no idea. For veterans, the ones that are in PTSD and suffering from having a hard time, keeping a job, and so they're not homeless.
Right.
Which, it's, at least on the surface, it seems like a pretty decent and humanitarian solution so people aren't living on the street.
Again, with the infrastructure the county has or doesn't have with sewer, it pretty much eliminates a lot of things like that. I mean, the smallest lot size they could have now per structure would be 1 acre, so it would severely curtail what they would, most of them are looking at get 6 per acre or something along those lines.
So they'd have probably in some of the city limits to do something like that. More and more.
Usually if you're on sewer, you're going to be annexed into the city.
That's what I'm saying.
Have we got one in the ball around?
It's not yeah, there's right there behind the elementary school. It's not they're built on site. They're not one of these tiny homes that they pull in on a flatbed trailer. And,
No, that's built there.
yeah, they're built on site.
The whole subdivision of them there.
But they're probably, looks like, I drove through there not long ago just to see. Looked like maybe the smallest one was 800 or 900 square feet. There's some that maybe, there's a couple 2-story that's being built, maybe 1400 square feet. But, they're not real large for sure.
They're full of people.
Well, the ones that are complete are sold. They're selling, I mean, it sounds like they're pre-sold already. So,
You can get kits for those now, can't you? You just
probably,
they do.
yeah, I think you buy them off Amazon. Amazon.
You couldn't bother me if I had about half what I got now.
Tell you. And also say for the record that if I did buy the Tate house and my friend Clay Pratt needed an outlaw suite, I'd let him build a 400, 500, 600 square feet.
You got those cabins down there, just how big
They
one it
carry
was.
those down.
Yeah.
So Ethan, have we about given you direction clear as mud here? Or is it better than that?
Well, this was just a suggestion, and I wasn't going to say this is the answer to all your prayers. I just wanted to show that this is something that other communities have done and seem to be able to defend and utilize pretty well. I'm not saying that the exact numbers that I gave you are exactly what would be perfect for your community. I think there is obviously some room there, but these are very similar to several other communities, so they're not just arbitrary out of a hat. It's the apples and oranges when you look at your ordinance and someone else's ordinance, they're certainly not exactly the same. So it's just trying to shoehorn and fit in closely as we can with what you all need and what's going to effectively accomplish what you all want.
So how are you working in the other communities?
They seem to be working fairly well. I've not had any issue in any of the communities that I've worked in where we do have a minimum. I know we get a lot of zoning requests. Most of the houses we're seeing built currently are somewhere around 1,200 square feet heated floor space on the small end. 900 square feet is pretty small overall, I think, when you start talking about minimum dwellings. We've not really had any issue with it. I mean, obviously, some people will come in and want a tiny home, a true tiny home, like off HGTV. And, I think they get disheartened at first, but then I think a lot of times they realize just how small 400 square feet is and realize that, well, 900 is not really that much bigger. It's not hire a builder and all these things. You can, a lot of times, build a 900 square foot house, spec house, probably cheaper than a custom tiny home. So a lot of times people start crunching the numbers, they figure out, well, they can that's more fitting for the family. I think some people just get that initial excitement from watching, seeing something on TV or seeing a neat community that somebody's made a development from or stayed at on an Airbnb somewhere, and just thought, well, this would be neat. Come to ask us about it. But we haven't had any issue in any of those meetings that I've worked in the zoning staff with in person to this day that have resulted in any legal action or anything like that. I think it's worked out pretty well. Most of the builders, like I said, again, are building. Right now, it seems like the market is, at least in the communities I've been working in, has been for around 1,200 square feet. Small family size dwellings. And again, I don't have the language in there, but the discussion for an accessory dwelling unit, maybe something to look at, see how that can be fit in. Potentially, I can get you that information. Bring that before you. If y'all are interested in that, as an accessory use to a principal dwelling, having that accessory dwelling unit. And that can be done on a conditional use basis so that you can figure out, is this going to be a permanent thing that's going to last forever? Is it a temporary thing for a family member to be cared for? And for the decision to be made, if that's going to be a permanent thing, is it going to be left in perpetuity for the next owners to deal with? So just some things to think about. There's a lot of hypotheticals when you start talking about things like that.
So we'll have a second opportunity to discuss all of this.
Absolutely.
Third, fourth.
Yeah.
You're an optimist.
Well, to that extent, I'll say the fact that we're getting down in the weeds and the details and discussing specific properties that it would affect in the county says we're a lot closer than we were 3 months ago. So I appreciate the effort for sure.
Absolutely.
I mean, a lot closer.
Well, this will give us an opportunity to digest what you've suggested between meetings
We haven't seen this until
and, yeah.
You can't vet it enough. I wouldn't want to see anybody jump on anything all of a sudden and then realize later and us go back and have to make 18 amendments to deal with things. So I think I definitely applaud the careful consideration.
Hudson, in Pickens County, there's not a lot of it now. I mean, all the buildings not even habitable. I think we're always trying to make this, I can't find anything for under $1,500. And I don't know, young people just starting out and other people who don't need it anymore. And we don't really have this thing that they can't have a place to live. Or a lot of people, sometimes they'll build a basement and then build a house over it later, live in it for a while. We don't want to,
Excuse me.
I got one of them up above me that is gonna build a basement and then build a house. That's 15 years old.
Still there. But it's a nice basement.
I bet.
Are we ready to talk about the next one?
If you're ready to move forward, I am.
Yep.
Move to the next item.
Yes, sir. Farming, I think we wanted to get into discussing some things about like wineries and some of these quasi-commercial practices that are popping up and affecting kind of your agricultural or very low-density residential areas. And I think the discussion there, and coming from an agricultural family, always trying to make sure that any regulations imposed is not harming the agricultural community in the area. And so one of the first things I did was look and see if there was actually a definition in the zoning ordinance just for farming. And I couldn't find one. There may be one that I'm not seeing, but I found this definition in another neighboring community's zoning ordinance that goes into a very pretty solid detail. And then also breaks down the organic farming and processing, which is something kind of new. And, you know, that's just something that having a definition for might be good because those can have some little nuanced differences between the two. And of course, agritourism, and getting into the meat of it, is breaking down into these things that are, farm tours and special events, and of course, like the apple houses and things like that, that may have an event venue for a couple events a year that are used as an accessory use to the primary use of the property, and the principal use being a farm that is there. And of course, the farmers, in a way to supplement their income, try to incorporate some form of tourism. And of course, the agricultural commissioner and the Georgia agritourism boards and everyone are very much trying to encourage a lot of farmers to do this, and across the state, and they create all kinds of various things to promote that. So we are seeing a lot of that in Georgia growing and so forth. And this agritourism is very much a common word and in the state of Georgia. And I think it just breaks down the definition there. In other words, again, create an ability for farms to have some of those uses that may in fact supplement their income and help them maintain for perpetuity. And of course, agritourism can be dealt with on a conditional use basis, so that way you're not just saying that, hey, if you got a farm, you can have an entirely unmitigated event center and so on and so forth. It's saying if you're going to have agritourism practices, come forth, apply for a conditional use permit. That gives you all and the commissioners a chance to look at that proposal, see exactly what they're proposing, and make those determinations. Is that accessory use going to be an accessory use, or is it going to take the place of the farm and then turn that farm into some kind of commercial entertainment enterprise or something like that, generate a lot of traffic and noise for the neighbors, things like that, change the dynamic of the neighborhood. That would give you all an opportunity to look at that and review it. And one of the ways to determine, I think in our last conversation, the question came up, and it's a very good question. How do you make the determination of the farm being the principal use on the property? And I thought about that, and actually when I was driving home after our last meeting, it hit me that there's this little thing that the state requires for any farm that's going to come forth and ask for an agricultural exemption card or a gate card, that they have to prove that they generate at least, now I believe the number's doubled to $5,000 of annual net income generated on that farm. So in here I wrote not just the gate, they don't necessarily have to have a gate card because maybe the farmer is not into going and doing the paperwork, but if they can prove and show that they can generate $5,000 of net income from the farm operation itself, then that would constitute a farm being the principal use of the property. And I think the way to deal with that from an administration standpoint is just to include an affidavit in that conditional use application. So they don't necessarily need to include that in the application. They could just very quickly sign a paper, and if in fact they were not being truthful and forthright, then I think that would give your zoning administrator and attorney the ability to later on, if they went back on their word or if they were doing something that they shouldn't, and again, not being forthright, that would be there as a measurable mark to go back and pull permits and revoke things if it became an issue and they did again get out of line. So that's just a way to set that bar, and also the way to administer that long-term with creating a very tangible asset. And again, that's just the current language. Now, I will say that $5,000 in net annual income, 10, 20 years from now, that's going to change. That's worth knowing, but of course, the zoning ordinance change every 10 years is not out of the question, or we could change the language such that it follows suit with just whatever the current Georgia agricultural tax exemption annual income level needs to be. So we can make it that way to make sure it's more fluid, but just wanted to put that out there as an opportunity or option to set that level and make sure that we are doing something that's, again, not arbitrary, but in fact a state definition. And then, of course, event center, just saying what is an event center, instead of breaking it down into like wedding venues and so on and so forth, and professional venues, we can just say event center, shoehorn all those into one, and use that as a defined use that is separate from agritourism. So if someone were to say, I want to build an event center, and you were to say, well, do you have, and you were in an agricultural area, and you were to determine that they in fact did not have a principal farm operation, and they wanted to build a wedding venue on a couple of acres in the middle of an agricultural community or residential community, and you could say, well, that's not an agritourism operation, that's a commercial operation. You're going to need to get a commercial rezoning. And if they still want to go through with that, they file that commercial rezoning application, chances are, more often than not, what they're going to do is be requesting a spot zone, a commercial island in the middle of a residential agricultural area, which is pretty much an easy automatic denial. And that would prevent having these isolated commercial islands and uses pop up in neighborhoods or in true agricultural areas where traffic generation and noise and all these things that we know are issues can just continue unmitigated without, other than, you know, a county complaint call in for somebody playing music too loud at 1 a.m. And so just being able to stop it before it has a chance to get there. This would, I think, set you up to have that ability.
That seems to be a very good solution.
I thought it was a
But,
very
but the flexibility to approve them where they're appropriate.
Where they're appropriate, right? You may have some instances to where it might not be it may technically be a spot zone, but it's on the highway and 2 lots over, there's a commercial business. So there, you know, that's kind of a case-by-case basis that you can deal with. But for those instances where you're just immediately saying this is the wrong thing to do here, I think this just helps build that foundation for a very defensible denial.
Do I understand that right, then, that the commercial zoning regulations would apply more stringent than just agricultural?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they're gonna, if they build anything in commercial, they're gonna have to be compliant with, of course they will in agricultural too, to a degree, but they'll have to be more compliant with things like parking and ingress, egress, all kinds of other supplemental things that agritourism may not be quite as restrictive for those things. They can have temporary parking areas and things like that.
You would have it already in your ordinance as opposed to having to post conditions.
Right.
Conditional. So,
Exactly.
On the surface, I like that idea along with the agritourism. Not so sure about organic farming and processing. What would be the advantage if we have the other two, having that conditional use?
That's just another definition of types of farming. It's, you know, with this new Georgia grown, putting in
don't we have to have something in there that recognizes them, or am I wrong with that?
you don't have to. This is just part of further defining farming. I mean, you could shoehorn organic farming into farming. I don't think it's necessary in this case. As long as there's a definition for farming in general practice, I think that's sufficient. This just goes that extra layer to add that, so it's not.
Yeah, my first thought was if it's a conditional use, but it's just there, what if they change their farming practices? There's no way for us to know if that's coming. And it's regulating a practice. It's not easily known necessarily, you know? So would we be sort of catching ourselves maybe down the road if somebody is not practicing organic practices and get caught, but we're zoned them for organic? You know, where's that oversight in? So I'm just kind of a little leery of that.
Are you allowing non-organic farms to allow public consumption on site or off-site wholesale retail marketing? I mean, would you have to change your definition of farming to include that as well? Or would you create a category? I guess what I'm asking is, are you saying that only organic farmers can sell their products on site, or will other farmers be allowed to do it? So is there some sort of...
I think other farmers would be allowed to. Yeah, this is just, again, it's just an extra layer that's not necessary. I just add that in as something to consider. So if that's not something that we don't want to go into that amount of detail, then we don't have to consider organic farming and processing. Because again, agritourism deals with the some of that on-site consumption and some of those things that we can address in agritourism. Just for general farm practice, it doesn't have to be organic. It could be inorganic, obviously. that would be fine. That would just be less.
I think if the Organic Farmer Coalition prescribes itself enough to agritourism and grows where they need signage and a validation, we can, we can revisit that.
Are there state regulations on what can be called organic and what they help to do? Is it
Yes.
set out as
Yes,
organic?
it's set up to be certified. I think it's USDA certified organic. That's the base language for that.
So our regulations should say that they are certified as an organic farm.
I think Lisa maybe just don't have a reference to organic farming and just let it kind of get swallowed up by the definition of agritourism, which seems to kind of include the benefits of that definition.
And if there's no further questions on farming operations there, I think we can segue into the next piece, I think pretty smoothly, because they're kind of similar. I think the whole point, I did give some other definitions in this case to break down for breweries, microbreweries, micro distilleries, and so forth. But to get to the end, which I think is the most relevant and what y'all were looking towards, is the farm winery operations. And this is something that, in recent years in Northwest Georgia has really picked up, especially in the mountain towns, it seems like. Farm wineries or micro wineries. Of course, generally the micro wineries wind up going in a more downtown environment or the city's environment, whereas farm wineries, of course, farm winery is actually defined in state law and they're regulated differently than a typical winery or even a micro winery. And there are things here that require, of course, one of those is it has to, 40% of its annual production must be done in the state where the winery is located. And of course, they limit the amount, volume of wine that they can make in a year, 24,000 gallons. And also you can see on there that it must be located on premise where a substantial portion is used for agricultural purposes, including the cultivation of grapes, berries, and fruits. So it needs to be on the vineyard. The vineyard needs to be a part of the winery. Or it needs to be owned by an individual who in that community, I believe it's in that community or in the state, owns that vineyard as well.
Right, and we have, in the beer and wine world, we've got a license for a farm winery.
Okay.
But if this is adopted, when we think about the grid, the updated grid that will be produced, what advantage, what difference, what's going to be the difference between a winery and an agribusiness?
Between a winery and like a farm winery here?
No, and
Agritourism?
agritourism, yeah.
They're very similar, I think, with a farm winery. It's just since there is that language about farm winery, just to have that in the zoning ordinance as an extra layer. I think because you would have to have it in your alcohol ordinance. I think permitting.
I think we've got it covered there. I'll have to go back and look at it. But I guess same thing Lee was saying about the organic farming. Is it already included in the definition of agritourism, or when the grid is finally produced, is there something that's going to be permitted in farm winery that's conditional in agritourism? And I know that in our licensing, we don't, I mean, they can care less what is on, really.
Right. Right. Yeah, if you wanted to include that into, and not have a definition for farm winery, then I think that you could do that as well.
I don't know, we may need it, I don't know. I don't know I don't know how the grid's gonna look when it's prepared, I don't know because I like what you took away the event center is now no longer a part of that discussion. And I think that's where we were getting into a lot of the trouble. So I think you really solved one of our big problems by how you have defined event center. So we may not need the extra language defining farm winery. I mean, we're fine as long as it's agritourism. And that could be a farm winery, an apple house that's non-organic or is organic, that allows, has a supplementary restaurant or something like that on a farm area. I don't know. I don't know. I mean,
You could shoot one in there.
Whatever you think after looking at how those grids come out, if there are distinctions there that we might be interested in. I think you saw it in Big Farm, we just don't make it any worse. With that definition, I think it's a very good definition of the end. So. Or whatever you want.
Do I have any other questions for Ethan or Rodney or Bill?
Appreciate the effort on this. Definitely advance things.
Very much so.
There's no other questions. The next item is new business. We have none. Item 5 is board comments. Any comments, questions?
Will we take, when will we take this back up? Next month? What do you?
Right now, we have, I believe we only have one rezoning for next month scheduled. So if we wish to pick up this, you know, let's check with this schedule, but I mean, we correct or make the changes or whatever that recommended, and take a look at some of the things that y'all requested that we look at.
I think we're trying to keep it fresh and moving.
We need to move it forward to get it done and taken care of.
Any other questions or comments? If not, public comments? I guess not.
Nothing, Dan?
He's not really the public, though. He's the press. No press comments. If not, okay, next item is adjournment. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So
Second. Motion carried. Meeting is adjourned.